Normally we'd arrest people in the drugs trade. But what happens when it's the British royal family? The royal family point one of the most popular and well-known institutions in the world. From royal weddings to birth announcements, the media frenzy surrounding the family has captured the attention of millions around the globe. However, what if I told you about their seedy past involving a drug trade and a war? In this video we explore the roots of the royal family's wealth, so if this topic interests you, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe. We will be uploading more royal family related content in the weeks to come. During the 19th century, Britain was involved in the opium trade with China. The British East India Company, which was responsible for India's trade with the rest of the world, began exporting opium from India to China in order to pay for Chinese goods such as tea and silk. The opium trade was highly profitable, but it had devastating effects on China's economy and society, as millions of Chinese citizens became addicted to the drug. The British government supported the opium trade, and some members of the royal family even had personal investments in the trade. For example, Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, invested in the opium trade through his stake in the British East India Company. The opium trade with China continued until the Chinese government finally took action to stop it in the mid-19th century. This led to the First Opium War between Britain and China. The First Opium War lasted from 1839 to 1842. The war was sparked by China's attempts to crack down on the opium trade, which was being used by Britain to balance its trade deficit with China. China's efforts to stop the trade led to a series of clashes with British merchants, which eventually escalated into open warfare. Despite being a vastly more populous and wealthy nation, China was ultimately defeated by the British in the First Opium War. The British, who had superior military technology and tactics, were able to overcome China's outdated and poorly equipped army. After the war, China was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanjing, which had a number of significant consequences. First, China was forced to pay a large indemnity to Britain, which included compensation for the opium that China had destroyed. Second, China was forced to open several ports to British trade, which effectively put an end to China's isolationist policies. Third, this treaty gave Hong Kong Island to Britain. The Treaty of Nanjing marked the beginning of a long period of humiliation and weakness for China, as it was subsequently forced to sign a series of unequal treaties with other foreign powers. These treaties, which granted foreign powers extraterritorial rights and other privileges, effectively stripped China of its sovereignty and led to a prolonged period of political and economic instability. The Hong Kong Acquisition. In 1898, Britain acquired a 99-year lease on the new territories, which included much of the land that comprises present-day Hong Kong. During this period, Hong Kong developed into a thriving center of commerce, finance, and industry, with a unique blend of Eastern and Western cultures. In 1997, the lease on the new territories expired, and Hong Kong was returned to Chinese sovereignty under the "one country, two systems" principle. Under this arrangement, Hong Kong was granted a high degree of autonomy, including its own legal system and basic civil liberties. However, in recent years, there has been growing concern among some in Hong Kong and the international community about the erosion of Hong Kong's autonomy and civil liberties. In 2019, large-scale protests erupted in Hong Kong in response to a proposed extradition bill that many saw as a threat to the city's autonomy. These protests evolved into a broader pro-democracy movement, with participants calling for greater political freedoms and an end to police brutality. China has responded with a crackdown on dissent, including the imposition of a national security law in 2020, which has led to the arrest and detention of numerous activists and journalists. The First Opium War aftermath. In response to the challenges presented from the First Opium War, China began a process of modernization and reform in the late 19th century, which aimed to strengthen the country and reassert its position on the world stage. This process, which was often painful and difficult, eventually led to the downfall of the imperial system and the emergence of a modern, more democratic China. The profits from the opium trade helped to fund Britain's industrialization and expansion of its empire. Some of the wealth generated by the opium trade flowed directly into the royal family's coffers, as members of the family held significant investments in the British East India Company and other companies involved in the trade. It is important to note that the opium trade was abolished in the 20th century and is now illegal in most parts of the world. Additionally, the profits from the opium trade did not directly contribute to Britain's modern economy, as the trade occurred in a very different economic and political context. However, it is true that the opium trade played a significant role in the history of British imperialism and the global economy in the 19th century. At the time, Britain was a major player in the opium trade, which was a lucrative industry that generated significant profits for British merchants and the government. The opium trade was used by Britain as a means of balancing its trade deficit with China, and the profits from the trade helped to fuel Britain's Industrial Revolution. The opium trade had a devastating impact on Chinese society. The trade led to widespread addiction and social instability, as well as contributing to the decline of the Chinese economy and political system. Today, the royal family's wealth comes from a variety of sources, including property, investments, and the government's annual grant. However, the legacy of the opium trade with China still haunts the royal family's history, as it raises uncomfortable questions about the sources of their wealth. The British monarchy is one of the wealthiest royal families in the world, with a net worth estimated to be in the billions of pounds, with a significant portion of the royal family's wealth being traced back to the opium trade. Final thoughts. The opium trade with China was a dark chapter in Britain's history, and its legacy continues to be felt today. While it is important to acknowledge the past, it is also worth noting that the royal family's wealth has diversified over time, and their current financial position is not solely dependent on the profits of the opium trade. Nonetheless, the history of the opium trade is a reminder of the complex web of economic and political relationships that shape the world we live in.